Any man who says he totally understands women is a fool because they are ununderstandable. Ununderstandable is not a word. It should be, it fits the pattern, but it isn't. Normally, you can take a verb in English and stick the able suffix on the end to indicate that whatever the verb describes is possible. For example, from to do, we get doable. From to run, we get runnable. And from to explore, we get explorable, and so on and so on. But sometimes we switch language roots in English. This is because English is a rich language that has had a lot of different inputs into its formation over time. So for example, to see does not give us the word seeable. It should, that fits the pattern, but that's not a word in English. Instead, we switch to a Latin root and we end up with the word visible. Similarly, the prefix un usually means not, but there are many cases where we switch to a different prefix to form the negation. Why? We just do. You don't say unhydrated, you say dehydrated. You don't say unpossible, you say impossible. And you don't say ununderstandable. Instead, we switch to a different word altogether to form the negation. We say incomprehensible. Learning all these different prefixes and when to use which one is painful for students of the English language, and even native speakers can sometimes get this wrong, as Michael Scott does here. The good news is that if you do choose the wrong prefix and or suffix, your meaning will almost certainly still be understood, even though the word that you formed is technically wrong. Ununderstandable makes sense to an English speaker, even though that's not a real word. Let's hear this line of dialogue in German. Jeder Mann, der von sich sagt, würde die Frauen total verstehen, ist ein Vollidiot. Frauen sind ganz und gar nicht verstehbar. Verstehbar is not a word. It should be, it fits the pattern, but it isn't. Just like we can in English, you can usually take a verb in German and add the suffix bar to indicate that whatever the verb describes is possible. For example, from machen we get machbar, from essen we get essbar, from vorstellen we get vorstellbar, and so on. But occasionally, just as in English, there are exceptions to this pattern. Perhaps not as many exceptions as we have in English, but it's possible in German for a word to fit this pattern, yet still be technically wrong. For example, from auf jemandem verlassen, we should get verlässbar, but instead we see verlässlich. And sometimes the word will change when forming the negation. For example, from vermeiden, we get vermeidbar, but when forming the negation, it becomes unvermeidlich. The good news is that German is more consistent here than English, but the bad news is that choosing which suffix to use with which words can sometimes turn into a guessing game, and it's easy to make a mistake. The translation team here did a perfect job of choosing a nonsense word in German to match the nonsense word in English. Verstehbar should mean understandable, but it's not an actual word in German. The proper word here is verständlich, and the negation would of course be unverständlich. Interestingly, just as in English, if you pick the wrong suffix by accident, the resulting word will still be understandable to any native speaker. Unverstehbar would be just as understandable to a German-speaking person as ununderstandable would be to an English-speaking person. So why am I zeroing in on this one line of dialogue? Well, true story, when I first watched this episode in German, I forgot that Michael Scott uses a nonsense word in the English version. So when I heard verstehbar and parsed it out in my head, I assumed that that was the German word for understandable, and that the German word for incomprehensible must therefore be unverstehbar. I used these words for an embarrassingly long time until a German person gently corrected me and said, "You know, verstehbar is not a word. The word you want is verständlich." The moral of the story is to be careful what vocabulary you pick up from TV shows, because sometimes the writers will use nonsense words if they're trying to show that the character in question is not particularly well educated. No offense to Michael Scott. That's all for today. We will see you next time on Learn German from TV.